Okay, so welcome to the information structure of brain and Qualia Symposium. So we have two wonderful speakers, Dr. Marieke and Dr. Shinji Nishimoto. And this symposium is supported by the grant called Qualia Structure. And here is today's schedule. So first, I'll briefly introduce the our mission of Qualia Structure Grant, and also introduce a little bit about Dr. Ma and Dr. Nishimoto's related work. And today's symposium should be interactive, so please ask questions if you have. And we have also discussion session as well, so please join these things as well. And first, housekeeping announcements here. So please turn off your mic. And we plan to share the contents of the symposium on YouTube. So if you speak up to ask questions, you might show up in the video. So please raise a hand in Zoom if you want to speak up to ask questions. And you can also ask questions either in Zoom chat or YouTube's comments. The chair or organizer of the session will pick questions from there to ask the questions to the speakers or panelists. And first, let me briefly introduce the Qualia Structure team member first. So these are the core members. And Nao Tsuchiya from Monash University, and Makiko Yamada from QST, and me, by the way, my name is Masafumi Oizumi from the University of Tokyo. So first, let me briefly introduce the Qualia Structure Grant goal and how this is related to today's talks. All right, so here is an introduction of the basic problem. So let's consider that visual stimuli are presented, and there should be some neural activities. And in conventional, neuroscience, we are asking how the external stimuli is transformed into a neural activity, and we have tried to assess the relationship between the stimuli and the neural activity. But in consciousness research and in our grant, we are asking a different question, which is how this neural activity is transformed into a subjective experience, consciousness, or qualia. And our goal is, finding a mathematical relationship between the qualia and neural activity. But of course, the problem here is that how can we quantify a quell? Is quell a mathematical object? So if you are asked, can you explain your subjective feeling, quell of redness of red? I think you cannot do it. You are at trouble to explain your subjective feeling. So we tend to think that it seems there is no way to quantify a quell. But there is actually a way to quantify the quell to some extent, which is using the relationship between a quell and other qualia. Like in this example, for example, you can say that whether red is similar to orange, for example, and red is dissimilar to green or light blue. These kind of relationship quantified by similarity can be actually quantified, and we can use this quantity as a characterization of some quell. And by accumulating many kind of such relationships, we can actually, closely characterize these qualia. And the entire structure of this kind of relationship actually represents the qualia of our colors. Sorry, the qualia of colors, for example. So we are focusing at quantifying this kind of qualia structure. And then the next question is that whether this qualia structure corresponds with the structure of neural activity patterns. If there is some isomorphism between the qualia structure and the structure of neural activity patterns, then we have some neural explanation about qualia. And this type of research actually has been done in the framework of representation similarity analysis. And Dr. Ma is a pioneering researcher on this technique and on this theoretical framework. Of course, that I think that in representative similarity analysis, they have not so much emphasized the qualia, but we are going to use this kind of framework in consciousness research. But the next question here is that do neural activity patterns themselves correspond well to qualia structure? Actually, sometimes yes, but sometimes no. So in that case, we need to consider further how these neural activity patterns should be transformed to correspond well with qualia structure. This is sort of a theoretical study of conscious research, which tries to find a mathematical transformation of neural responses into qualia. And we call structure of transform neural responses by G information structure. And encoding and decoding approach is actually one way to directly find G transformation G empirically. And Dr. Nishimoto is a pioneering researcher using encoding and decoding approach. So therefore, we invited to one of the speakers today. So that's all, and enjoy the symposium. Thank you.
Okay, so now I'm going to introduce Dr. Marieke Mar. She has been, as Masafumi already introduced, Marieke is a pioneer in representation similarity analysis, and she's now a faculty in the University of Western Ontario. And you're currently trying to combine psychology, neuroscience, and the AI to understand human brain better. And also recently, you also did similarity, sort of a reconstruction from deep neural network and so on. So you are working kind of quite a close topic to us. So we are very looking forward to hearing your talk. Please go ahead.
All right. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for inviting me and also for this introduction. So I'm going to share my screen and then I can show you some slides. All right. So the title of my talk is Predicting Perceptual Representations from Brain Activity. So first, I am going to show you some images here. And they're going to be quite fast, but just, pay attention. Okay, so that was just a few images, but what becomes clear here is that even if they're presented quite briefly, we still get a rich experience of these images. We also immediately interpret what's going on and understand what kind of objects are present. So it's quite an impressive feat that we can do this so quickly. And computationally, this is not trivial. So that, of course, raises the question, how does the brain extract meaning from visual input? And usually, of course, when we see a stimulus, so for example, this apple over here, then that stimulus elicits brain responses. And then I want to focus today on high-level visual cortex, which is approximately located here. So that's IT, stands for inferior temporal cortex, which is a region in the brain that's involved in object perception. And I want to discuss with you what type of information that region represents about objects. So part of the talk will focus on that, but also, and we'll get to that indeed, whether we can explain our perceptual experience of visual objects from representations in that brain region. So why is there this focus on IT here? Well, because it's reasonably well understood, but it's still somewhat mysterious. So we don't exactly understand everything there yet. Also, it's at the interface between perception and cognition. So that's what makes it interesting for thinking about consciousness and qualia. So there's usually a perceptual experience associated with these response patterns that are elicited by seeing images. And also in, let's say, the last 5 years or so, the processes happening in IT have to some extent become more computationally tractable using deep neural networks. So let's first start. So I'm going to go through a few questions. The first question that I would like to address is whether we can predict brain responses from stimulus properties. So we're going to focus now first on the brain responses, but as we'll see, we'll also already take into account some aspects of conscious perception in explaining the brain responses. So here, what we did to address this question, basically asking about the transformation from the stimulus to the responses, is to show people object images and then ask these human observers to generate labels describing the object. So we asked for two types of labels. One is visual features. So for example, for this apple, people generated these labels, green, round, it says something about the color and the shape. And we also asked them to generate category labels of categories at different levels of abstraction, including basic and superordinate levels. So for this apple, people generated, for example, the following descriptions. So now what we can do is we can ask how well each of these can explain the brain representation. And that's quite interesting because we know from monkey electrophysiology work that visual features of intermediate complexity is what's activating neurons in IT. And we know from human fMRI work that categories can explain quite a lot of variance in the responses measured with, for example, fMRI. So each of these seem to contribute to explaining the representation, but their explanatory power had not been directly compared. So that's what we set out to do. And of course, then we need to understand how we can relate these descriptions to brain responses in order to predict the brain responses. So in order to do that, we use single image designs where each image is its own separate condition. And then we can measure response patterns to each individual image with fMRI in a brain region of interest, in this case, IT. And then we can use representational similarity analysis, which was already briefly explained, right? But I'll go through it just to make sure that it's clear for everyone. So we have done these different images. They elicit brain responses. And we compute the similarities between these response patterns and store these in a big matrix. So this is a representational dissimilarity matrix. And that matrix can be seen as basically summarizing what kind of information a particular brain region is emphasizing and de-emphasizing about the objects. Because the matrix, as you can see, there's stimuli on the axes. So This is now, I'm going to show you for IT what the matrix looks like. But the stimuli here are also shown. So they're a little bit small, but they're basically stimuli from a wide range of categories, colored photographs, including faces and places, animals, etc. And now we can measure response pattern dissimilarities for all possible pairs of objects. And if we do this in human observers, then what we see is this matrix where we're color coding the dissimilarity. So blue means dissimilar response patterns and red means similar response patterns. And then we get this result. So this is based on actual data. You may have seen this before, but just to highlight that there's immediately two features that stand out here. And that's the division between animates and inanimates, and also a tight cluster of human faces. So they elicit similar response patterns. This is useful. This gives us an idea of what type of information is represented about the objects in IT. And it does seem to suggest already a bit of a link to perception. For example, faces, they're also perceptually a highly salient category. So now the next thing that we can do, and this is relevant to our question that we are addressing at the moment, is to also do the same thing for a model. And this model that can be a computational model like a deep neural network, but it could also be a conceptual model. And that's what we are currently looking at. So that's the model based, for example, on these labels of visual features or category labels provided by human observers. And in this case, the response patterns are just patterns across features or categories. And for each of the images, we have such a pattern. And then we can again compute the similarities. So at that point, we can now ask how well each of these different conceptual models can explain the brain representation. So here I'm just showing you a zoomed in version of the visual features model. And here you see the images on the side here and the different properties or visual features on top. And whenever you see black, it means the feature was judged to be present by human observers. So this is only part of the model. I'm just going to zoom out so you can see the whole model. And as you can see now, in this model, we again have these response patterns. So the rows are response patterns across visual features, one for each image, from which we can now compute the similarities. But there's one more point that I wanted to make here, and that is that not all visual features may contribute equally in explaining the brain representation. So we also did one additional step, which is representational feature weighting. So we weighted the features to best explain the brain representation using independent data. And then what happens is this, so each feature gets a different weight, and then the model starts to look more like this. So once we have this model, we can now predict the similarities by taking the response pattern dissimilarities, right? And we can generate a prediction. This is just shown schematically here. But that prediction now can be compared to actual data. So that would be data from human IT that I just showed you. And then, of course, there's going to be some residuals because our model is usually not perfect. Plus, there's noise in the data. So let me show you results now. So in our scenario, we wanted to create these model predictions of the IT object representation. This was the data. And then the models, I'm going to show you what predictions they give. And this is the category model. So it does look quite similar to IT. There's also some differences. Now the feature model generates this prediction. So again, you can see some features there of the representation in the brain. But it's also slightly different, right, from the category prediction. And we also had a model where we combined both. So it's both features and categories, because maybe if we combine them, they can explain more variance. So at this point, of course, we want to quantify these relationships, and we do that simply by correlating the model predictions with the brain data. And then we can plot that in this bar graph here, where on the y-axis, we have model performance. So that's the correlation with IT. And this is the noise ceiling that indicates performance of the true but unknown model given the noise in the data. So ideally, we want to reach the noise ceiling because then our model is as good as the unknown true model. So what we're now seeing here is for features, I'm showing how strongly it's correlated, the prediction of the feature model with the IT object representation. So there is a significant correlation, but the model doesn't reach the noise ceiling. So now, of course, the question is, what about the category model? Will that do better? So it actually does not do better. It is also significantly correlated, but not significantly different from the features. And the third model that we can now look at is the combined model. So would that do better potentially? Well, actually, it doesn't. So again, there's no significant difference between any of these models in explaining the brain representation. That may initially seem slightly dissatisfying, but it's actually quite interesting because that suggests that these categories and visual features are explaining the same variance in the brain data. And that suggests the following. So just to summarize this, here I'm showing the model variance. So black is the variance that the model can explain in IT. And what this shows is how we can interpret this result. So basically, the explanatory power of both models derives from the shared variance. And that means that only features that are correlated with categories explain IT. So that's quite interesting because you can imagine that the visual system may compute these features that are relatively easy to compute from images, but are also related to semantics. So that's certainly one way to look at this. And then you can say that visual features may serve as stepping stones towards semantics. So now let's go on to the next question. So that would be whether we can predict brain responses directly from the stimulus, so from the image. So not asking people first to generate these labels and then using them to predict the brain representation, but directly take the image and then predict the brain representation. And there, of course, we now get to deep neural networks. So these deep convolutional neural networks have been used more and more in the last let's say 5 to 10 years. And why are they so popular? Well, one reason is that they are image computable. So you can indeed take the image and then the network can transform it, in our case, into a category label, which is also a task that the human visual system is performing. And these networks achieve human level performance on object categorization. And that was not the case for previous models. So it's certainly better than previous models at simulating or performing on the task, and to some level also, to simulate actual brain responses. So here I'm just showing an example of a deep neural network. Many of you may have seen this. This is basically the vanilla AlexNet. So you can see that the network is inspired by the brain, only loosely, of course. So here's the image on the left, and then you can see that is fed to the network, and the network itself consists of multiple layers. And then at the output level, we have this last layer that encodes 1,000 categories in this case. This is for a particular image, basically ImageNet, particular database. But in between, we see multiple layers. So that corresponds to having multiple regions across the ventral visual stream. And we also see that there's units in each layer that are connected with weights. These weights can be changed through training. And the training procedure usually is that the network needs to learn a mapping between the images in the input and a category label, so that it can provide the correct category label after training for a new image. And now, of course, the question was, well, do these representations in the network correspond to what we see in the brain? Because the network, of course, has representations as well. So once you feed an image to it, there will be patterns of activity across the different layers, which you can use again to compute an RDM. So here is the predictions of AlexNet, that network I just showed you, for the IT object representation. So what we can see here first is the IT representation. And then I'm going to show these different layers now of AlexNet. And this is the first layer. So in AlexNet, also these different layers correspond roughly, right, to the hierarchy in the ventral visual stream. So here you can see that human faces elicit similar response patterns. They're also visually similar, so that makes sense. And then if you go to the next convolutional layer, again, you still see faces, human faces eliciting very similar response patterns, and a bit of other structure emerging. But the real, let's say, category structure only starts to emerge later in these fully connected layers when we get closer to the output of the network. And that's what you can see here. And at that last layer, this is the category layer, so that indeed looks a bit more categorical. So now the question is, can these representations explain the representation in the brain? Because if they can, then this model may be a good starting point as basically an explicit computational model of what the ventral visual stream may be doing. So we can now add the prediction, so we can weight the different layers to optimally predict IT. And when we do that, we can add AlexNet now to our previous graph. So the question is, of course, does it do better or worse than these other models? And I'm not sure what you're expecting, but the outcome is the following. So it actually doesn't do significantly different. And it's quite interesting to see that, because that's not such a bad outcome. It means that AlexNet can explain IT equally well as these descriptive models that are derived from features and categories. So what we've gained here is that now we can actually compute the representation directly from the image, and we don't have to ask humans for the labels. And now we get to the point that I think is probably most interesting in terms of the relation to the symposium here, and that is to ask whether the representation in IT can actually predict perception, because there's of course a perceptual experience associated with these response patterns in IT, and the question is then, how similar are these representations to what we see in the brain? So here we can simply now replace the model with perception. And in the case of perception, what we do is we could, for example, and that's what we did, acquire similarity judgments. So here we just ask for people to judge the similarity between all these object images that we also showed to people in the fMRI scanner. And the way we actually did that was to let them arrange the objects on the screen. So we gave them all these objects, and then we said, arrange them inside the circle, and that's where we asked the participants to basically arrange them so that the distance between these different images would reflect how different they perceive them to be. So if you place them closer together, people would perceive them to be more similar. Place them further apart, they would perceive them to be more different. And that's quite useful. It's kind of an intuitive way of estimating the representation. And also it made it faster than, for example, pairwise similarity judgments, which is something that requires quite a bit of time. Because if you have all the images on the screen, then when you move one of them, that adjusts a lot of similarities or dissimilarities at the same time. So that worked reasonably well. And then, of course, the question is, well, how is this representation going to look like? And here I'm going to show you data. This is from 16 human observers. So here we see, again, the different stimuli on the axis, and this is the representation. So there's a few things to notice here. So on the one hand, there are similarities, right? So between the brain representation and the perceptual representation, which is this animate-inanimate division that's pretty clearly present in both of them. And also this cluster of human faces. But in addition, what we see is that there's also some differences. So we'll get to that in a moment, right? But you can see already that it seems that the representation in terms of our perception is a little bit more categorical, and also emphasizes some different types of information and different category divisions, because you can see these blue large blocks on the diagonal, and they are basically humans and animals. And then the other two are man-made and natural objects. So we'll get to that in a bit more detail later. But let's further investigate this and ask a few more questions about the relationship between these two representations. So what we can ask now here again is to correlate them and ask, how well does the brain representation explain perception? So here you can see the noise ceiling for our judgments. It's a little higher, right? Because there were more participants, and also the judgments tend to be less noisy. So that would be where the true model of our mental representation or perception of the objects would reside given the noise in the data. And now we can see how close the brain data actually comes to explaining the judgments. So here it is, and here we see, well, there is a significant correlation, but we're certainly not in the noise ceiling yet. So that's good to know. It means that there's still something potentially missing, right? But at least we are doing a reasonable job here. And actually, what I now show is the correlation here between the two full matrices, but you can also look at subsets of images, because maybe this correlation is largely driven by the category structure that we see in both the brain representations and the similarity judgments. And that is useful. That is certainly indicating a link, but it's good to also see whether any of the finer grained structure, so within categories, structure of the representation may also match between the judgments and the brain data. So therefore, we also correlated the two for subsets of images. And yeah, this is what I just mentioned, right? But this holds within categories that the IT representation predicts perceived similarity. So it holds within faces only, within body parts, within humans, animals, natural objects, and artificial objects. So that suggests that there's really components of the structure in the representation that match also within categories. And importantly, the object representation in early visual cortex, which we also measured with fMRI, does not predict perceived similarity that is measured with the judgments. So there really seems to be this link between the higher level object representation and the perceptual experience of the objects. And that link is not present for a lower level visual region. So now the question is here, yeah, can we do better? Because indeed, we're not at the noise ceiling, right? So, well, let's see. Let's look at our previous models that we had. So these were the feature labels, the category labels, the combined model, and also AlexNet, the deep neural network. So I'm going to put these in here now. First, I'm going to show you two models that do very well. So here they are. They're getting close to the noise ceiling. So which models would that be? Would that be the categories or the features, or would it be AlexNet? If anyone knows, then please feel free to speak up. Or a guess. Well, let me reveal it. So it's the categorical model and the combined model, which includes the category labels. So that model does quite well at explaining the judgments. And that is not, that's consistent or plausible with what we saw in the judgments, because the judgments were relatively categorical. And the categorical labels, of course, capture that variance. So this is certainly something that is plausible given what we saw. And that's good to see that there are certainly these models that do better. And they are actually models that were based on judgments provided by human observers. So that is also understandable that does explain these different judgments when they are judging the similarity between objects. So it tends to basically say that there is a large categorical component in these judgments and in terms of our perception. And then these other models, they're over here. So this is AlexNet and the feature-based model. They are significantly correlated with the judgments, but they're not as strongly correlated as the categorical models. And that's also something you can see here based on statistical inference. These categorical models do better than the others. And the feature-based model does worse than most of the other models. So perceived similarity is best predicted by category labels. And now let's investigate some of these differences, because we saw that there were some differences as well between the brain representation and the judgments. So here what I'm showing now is pie charts. And for both human IT, so the brain data and the similarity judgments, these pie charts show the proportion of total category related variance explained by each division. And I'm going to show you these divisions in a moment. But the total category related variance was determined by fitting a category model that had several predictors, which will come up and are associated with these different colors. And then you can just ask for each of them, the variance that is explained by this category model, what are the relative contributions of different category divisions to that explained variance? So that's why we have a pie chart that for each is 100%. So what we see here is the red is actually corresponding to the animate-inanimate division. So that's very strongly present in IT, as we also saw in the RDM. And it's present in the similarity judgments as well, but it's not as large in terms of its contribution to explaining variance. Then the next one is the division between faces and bodies, which is quite clear in the IT representation, but I would say absent in the judgments. However, in the judgments, there's these new divisions that come in. And that's what we see over here. So that is artificial versus natural objects. And that's something that is evolutionary, more recent. And also humans versus animals. So again, both of these divisions are related to human or non-human. So we also performed inference to test whether these proportions were indeed significantly different between IT and the judgments, and they are. So what we just observed is also supported further by doing a statistical inference. So what this suggests is that similarity judgments reflect, but also transcend IT, introducing these additional human-related category divisions. And now I see I have a little bit more time, so I could still, one moment, I'm just gonna have a few slides that I was hiding still also to show here. So that may be interesting. Yeah, so now one of the questions is which of these brain regions may actually contribute to a more flexible categorization, because that's something that in IT seems to be missing somewhat. It's a pretty stable representation. It doesn't really emphasize more recent evolutionary distinctions. So which brain regions may then contribute? And of course, what we then may assume is, let's see, could be prefrontal regions. So I have this data set where I varied two things, and that was the stimuli. So that's similar to here, but also the task. So I asked people to make different, to categorize the objects differently based on a particular task rule. So that's more flexible categorization. And then you can ask for each of my regions of interest, which involved V1, V2, V4, etc. So these are the ventral visual regions, but also parietal and frontal cortex. And you can ask for each of them how much of the variance can be explained by these different factors. So it's stimulus-related variance, task-related variance, and the interaction between stimulus and task. And then for V1, yeah, what we see here first is the within subject variation. And then we can ask how much of that can we explain using our paradigm, our design. And we can see here that this blue indicates stimulus-related variance. And then red is task-related variance. So that's the different categorizations that people made. And then there's also interaction between the two. And what we see in V1, that's really dominated by stimulus-driven variability. Now, if we go up the hierarchy, we can see in V2, it's very similar to V1. V3, we get a little bit more variance explained by task and the interaction with stimulus. V4 is very similar. IT, also quite similar. But now we move to prefrontal and parietal regions, which of course are thought to be more involved in higher order cognitive function. And what we see here in IPS, we see that there is about the same amount of stimulus and task related variance and some variance explained by the interaction between the two. But in the frontal IFG, so this is a frontal junction, inferior frontal junction, we see that there is the majority of variance explained by the task, and also the interaction between the two, and not so much stimulus-related variance. So in terms of flexible categorization, that may be driven more by representations in higher order regions in association cortex. And that's something that this clearly shows. It also shows that in this task, the variance, there's less variance explained, right, by our model in frontal regions, because they're usually noisier when we measure from those regions with fMRI. So in visual regions, stimulus effects dominate task effects. And in prefrontal cortex, we see the opposite pattern. So conclusions, we've now arrived at that last slide here. Visual features, they may serve as stepping stones towards semantics. Then second, similarity judgments. So that's related to our conscious perception of objects. They reflect the high-level visual representations, but they also transcend them because they introduce these additional human-related category divisions. And then finally, deep convolutional neural networks are promising image computable models for human visual cortex and potentially also behavior. So that's maybe something to add here. We also use these convolutional neural networks to explain the judgments. And there you do see that they perform quite well. They perform at a similar level as IT. So they're not performing better or equally well as the categories, but they do perform at a similar level as IT in explaining the judgments. So that's just a last point to add here. And with that, I would like to end the talk.
Thank you very much, Marieke. Very clear talk, and I am pretty sure there will be lots of questions, and we'll have an interesting conversation here. As Masami said, that the content of the questions will be recorded, so be mindful. And we can also take a question from a YouTube audience as well. If you have a question from the Zoom audience, please raise the hand or type it in chat, and then I can pick it up. If you don't have it right now, then maybe I can start as taking advantage of the chair. So when you're talking about noise ceiling, is it based on the inter-individual difference in fMRI response and also judgments? Right?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, exactly. So that's a very good question, because how do you actually estimate what the true model is if you don't know it? And it's indeed based on subject variability. So the idea would be there that the true model can be, let's say, assessed or can be simulated by the subject average RDM. So this indeed uses the assumption that you would say, okay, each subject that we test is a random draw from a human. And then we can say, okay, we can look at the inter-subject variability to determine what the noise ceiling is. So for the lower bound, we compute the subject's average RDM, where we leave out one subject, and then we correlate the average with that one left out subject. Do this for each subject and average that, and that's the lower bound. And for the higher, sort of the upper bound, there we also include the subject that we correlate with the mean in the mean. So that's let's say overfit to the subject, but that's why it's the upper bound.
I see. And the reason why I asked this is because from the consciousness research point of view, if different people see things slightly differently, then usually we want to also address the intra-individual variance, or like even trial by trial appearance difference, right? So I'm sure that you have done lots of RSA analysis. So have you tried something like that in the past?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I haven't tried this in terms of computing a noise ceiling, because then you need to start thinking about how else to compute this. One thing that maybe you could start doing is that you would compute this for each individual subject with repeated measures over time. And then you would just say, well, this is a unique model for this subject and we base it on repeated measurements of that subject, maybe that's an option. But ideally, you of course also want some level at which you can aggregate the data across subjects, and that I haven't really tried. So I do think that it's certainly interesting to look at inter-individual differences, and you can in some ways use RSA in a slightly different way there, where one thing you could do is instead of having stimuli on the axes, you could have subjects, and then you could see if there's any patterns there in terms of how subjects are related to each other and if they potentially cluster or not. It could be that everyone is equally individually unique, so you don't see any clustering, right? Everyone is equally distant from each other, but maybe you do see some clusters, and that could be very interesting, I think, to investigate further. So RSA could potentially also be used in that way. But yeah, that's not something I have explored deeply.
I see. Okay. Yeah, because we are doing something similar to what you're proposing here, like trying to do the repeated measure and so on, using color stimulus. But yeah, exactly, we are interested in that kind of direction. Okay, now we are going to take some questions from the participants. Aniko, you are the first person who asked the question.
Yeah, so thank you for this very interesting talk. I am really fascinated with this connection between convolutional neural networks and how we can use them to get better models of perception. And I was wondering if have you considered or have you heard anything about people attempting to use convolutional neural networks to model individual differences? So basically, I'm thinking if there are different, slightly differently trained networks, could we use something similar, just as you talked about before, to model inter-individual differences?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. So one thing that we do often do with these networks is that we train them multiple times, and then you can inspect the differences between the networks. And what's interesting, so what's different there, the only thing that's different there when we do that is that we the weight initialization is different, because the weights are always initialized before you start training, and then if you do this multiple times, you just have a different initialization, and then you can see whether that leads to a different network. And what turns out to be the case is that in terms of learning a solution, if we think about object categorization at least, the network will learn this, and it can find many different solutions that may lead to equally comparable accuracies in terms of categorizing objects. However, that may be achieved through slightly different weights, right, in a network. And then you do see that there is some individual variability between networks, just depending on how you initialize the weights. And that's quite interesting. So that's one way, but I think that's not enough to simulate human variability, because humans also differ in many other ways. So there may be slight differences in the, let's say, network itself. So that's how our brains are organized to start with. And then there's, of course, differences in the learning experiences that people have throughout their lives. So that's something that would be very interesting, I think, to incorporate in these neural network training. And then also, this will allow you, if you do this with neural networks, to really target specific aspects that you think may contribute to individual differences, and then see how much the effect is on the representations in these networks and how much they differ. So that could be quite interesting, I think, to explore.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's definitely very fascinating.
Okay, next, Yota.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so thanks for the talk. It was very interesting. And I have a question about the characterization of stimulus. So you explained that you asked the subject to label based on category and features. So I wonder whether you did or focus on the physical properties, such as like luminance or color distribution of RGB or something like that.
Yeah, that's a good question. So we didn't focus on this in instructing participants. So there's two things, I guess, also in terms of equating that among the stimuli. But in terms of the participants' instructions, we did tell them quite clearly to, for the visual features, that they should report features of the objects that are visible and that don't describe the entire object. But then, and for the categories, we said it should describe the whole object, and there should be different levels of abstraction, and we also instructed them with examples. So that's what we did there. In terms of the stimuli, we did not equate either luminance or brightness or color because we wanted to keep it more natural. But what we did do is, of course, you can process these images in models that indeed analyze these particular properties. So there's lots of different color spaces, right? So you can actually compute the representation of these objects in these color spaces. And you can also do this to some extent for other features. And then one thing we did do is ask whether in those representations, lower level visual features, also if you can use just pixel similarity or the representation in the first layer or second layer of the convolutional neural network. And in those representations, one thing we did look at is whether there is a categorical organization there that's perceivable, because you could imagine that colors may differ between animates and inanimates, or human faces have a particular color potentially, but there was no clear categorical structure. So it wasn't as clear as we saw either in the brain representations or the judgments. And that's what we did do. So we did analyze the stimuli to see, well, if we look at these different features, what is actually the representation based on those.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
Sounds all right. Great. Yeah, I also had a question about the attention. How much attention would change the similarity judgment itself or response similarity? But maybe you already explained it. Okay, let's go to.
I know. Well, yeah, I didn't, but I don't know if we have time left. But
do you have something to show or?
No, I don't have something particular to show, but I did look at some. So basically, attending makes yeah, if you do this with brain data, then of course you do see that whenever you attend to a particular object, you get an enhancement of that object. But this doesn't work for features, right, of the same object, because that's something I tried. I was like, maybe we can enhance the particular feature of an object. But of course, in Decibone and Duncan's like 95 paper about bias competition, clearly it's already obvious from those experiments that objects access holes in competition. And that's definitely what I saw too. You cannot enhance a particular feature. You need competition between multiple objects, and then attention will enhance that representation of the object you're attending.
Yeah, great. All right, Ariel.
Hey, thanks for the great talk. It's super interesting. I've got a question about the pattern of similarity responses you get from your participants. So when I've collected dissimilarity data, certainly within categories, if not between categories, sometimes I have participants who are super categorical and they say, let's say like all cars look exactly the same. And sometimes I get ones that are much more continuous and they like use a much smoother range. So I'm curious as to whether you see that in your data as well. And if you do, what I'm most curious about is, do you see any neural measures that track it? Because I've always wondered, is it because there are actual similarity perceptual differences between participants, or just different strategies they use, but they actually look the same to them?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So if you look at this in terms of the similarity data, I also saw variability between subjects where some were more categorical than others. And you could certainly see that. One thing is that the way we measured the judgments, it did, let's say, focus on, so if people arrange things completely on top of each other, for example, they had multiple trials, and then the next trial would zoom in on those two images, for example, because it would say, I want some evidence. They shouldn't be completely the same. So it was definitely pushing a bit for at least showing some or getting some data on all of them. But I did see variability. And there was one subject who arranged the objects not based on any categorical, because the instructions were very broad. it just said, please arrange these objects according to their similarity, because we wanted to see what people would do. And the majority uses categories, but there was one subject who reported in the debriefing that he used color and shape, etc. So it looks quite different, and it actually matched more closely to his V1 representation of the objects, which is quite interesting. But I didn't see what you suggest in terms of the brain representations really matching closely to what the subjects did in their judgments. The brain representations, yeah, they're more less categorical for everyone, and I think it's more a strategy choice.
Thanks.
That's great. Okay, and then we have 2 more questions so far within the Zoom. Peter Sadowski, are you there, or should I read your question?
Oh yeah, I'm here. So my question was, how big is this data set, and is it publicly available? Because I think you're using like a linear model, and you're using a set similarity function. But in machine learning, there's this whole area of metric learning where you can plug everything into a deep neural network, and that'll try to learn your similarity function. And so it would be super cool. Like, this seems like a very promising approach, but to do those things, you need like big data sets.
Yeah, so yeah, that does sound very interesting. So this data set is not big. It's 16 subjects, 1/6. It would, of course, if you would be interested, that would be available, but I'm sure that's definitely not enough. What I should mention, though, is that I don't know if you heard about Kendrick K's natural scenes data set. So this is images from MS COCO, a subset for which Kendrick K and Thomas Nassalaris, they basically acquired fMRI data, 7T data, for a subset of these images. And there's a subset of 1,000 images that's shared between their subjects. And they also have, for a subset of those, Jan Charest, acquired similarity judgments. So I think that may be somewhat more promising, but there it's more in terms of not really the number of subjects, but it would be more in the repeated measurements over subjects, because that's the design they went for. But we're certainly also still planning some further studies where we have larger sets of subjects going up to maybe about 200. So that would be something, if you're interested in, you can always write me. That's still starting, right? So we don't have that yet, but there may be more data available sort of in the next year or so.
Okay, great. And then Sagar, do you want to ask a question, or should I read it out for you?
Hello, thank you.
Hi.
I actually missed quite a bit of it because I had problems connecting. I was just wondering, I showed towards the end, you were showing activity in V1 and V2 and prefrontal cortex, and looking at how much they could explain. But I'm just wondering whether you also looked at posterior parietal cortex, which could be quite important for.
Yeah, so I looked at IPS, so the interparietal sulcus, and it was a pretty big ROI. And there we did find, quite interestingly, that the amount of variance explained by these different, let's say, factors, so stimulus, task, or the interaction between both, was in between a bit if you look at, for example, IT and then prefrontal regions, because prefrontal regions were really dominated by task, V1 dominated by stimulus, and in IPS, this was about equally divided between those two. So that was quite interesting to see. What that exactly, of course, says about what it's computing, that's still open, right? But it seemed to be somewhat in between the visual and the prefrontal results.
Okay, great. And there's also question now, another question from Ken Mogi. Do you want to ask a question, or should I read it out for you?
Very nice talk. I enjoyed it. I was wondering if, since you were talking about task-related variations in the prefrontal area, if you asked the subjects to categorize, in addition to visual features, value-based or behavior-based categories like affordance and embodiment-related categories, how would you think the results would have been affected? And
that's a good question. So I do think it will definitely matter what type of property is being judged. So I could imagine if it's about value, if you look, for example, at orbitofrontal cortex, maybe you will see more of a representation there of value that could be reflected in the judgments. I am currently collaborating with several researchers here who are interested in that. So they're interested in food, right? And value associated with food. So they are starting to look at this with images of food and then measuring from prefrontal regions to see if they can indeed, see a structure there that also comes through in these judgments about the value participants make about that food. So it's an open question as far as I am aware, but it's a good suggestion.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Ed. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so with that, I would like you, Marieke, to go to Gather.
Yeah.
By clicking the link that I sent you in chat.
Okay, so let's begin the next session. Okay, just as a reminder, please mute yourself before we start. Okay, I'm the chairperson for the second talk, Makiko Yamada from QST. The second speaker is Dr. Shinji Nishimoto. Dr. Nishimoto is a professor at Osaka University. As Masafumi introduced in the opening talk, Dr. Nishimoto's research focuses on understanding neural processing and representation by building predictive models of brain activity worked under natural, perceptual, and cognitive conditions. Dr. Nishimoto, we are very much looking forward to your talk. If you are ready, please go ahead.
Thank you for your kind introduction, Dr. Yamada. So I will.
Yeah, can you share the slide? Yes.
Yes. So is it on screen?
Yes.
Okay. So thanks again for having me here in this wonderful symposium. And I think in particular, Tsuchiya-san, Yamada-san, Oizumi-san, and all the organizers, and thank everyone for coming here. So today I would like to talk about our recent studies, some of our recent studies regarding encoding and decoding of cognitive functions. So we have been working on understanding how the brain works under naturalistic daily life conditions. And towards such a goal, we record brain activity evoked by naturalistic experiences like watching movies or performing naturalistic tasks. Then we built encoding and decoding models that aims to explain the relationship between the experience and the evoked brain activity using latent representational features. That is, what kind of features in our experiences are encoded in brain activity, or given a special temporal pattern of brain activity, what kind of experience we can decode. And our approach is applicable to any brain activity measurement techniques. And indeed, we have been using many kinds of techniques, including human fMRI, unit recording, photon imaging, ECOG, and so on. But today, I would like to focus on our results using human fMRI that achieves the highest spatial resolution as non-invasive techniques. So here is a summary of my talk today. So I would like to talk about some of our recent works to understand information structure and processing in the brain. In particular, the main topic is to understand representational structure of cognitive functions as a kind of new extension of our encoding and decoding modeling efforts. Then briefly, I would like to also introduce you two related works. One is about the emotion structure in the brain, and the other is about the relationship between cross-modality and attentional modulation of linguistic information. So previously, we have built encoding and decoding models of brain activity during naturalistic visual experiences, like watching movies. By analyzing the movie-evoked activity using dynamic visual features like motion energy features, we revealed how visual shape and motion information are beautifully mapped around the occipital cortex in a retinotypically organized manner. We also demonstrated that the inverse model or decoding model can be used to reconstruct visual experiences from a human brain activity. By using natural language or linguistic processing techniques, we have also modeled the human visual system and revealed the semantic space that represents how the human brain organizes thousands of object and action categories in the brain, and also how that semantic space is warped or distorted during attentional tasks to improve the efficiency of cortex-wide representations. Then by inverting the model or building a decoding model, we have also succeeded in decoding perceived semantic contents from movie-evoked brain activity. So these are just a few examples of how encoding and decoding models can be used to examine comprehensive perceptual representations in the brain. So our previous efforts mainly focused on perception domains that are rather passive and instantaneous. That is, the brain receives information from the world, and our models examined how the brain processes the information as image, semantic, impressions, and so on. However, our daily lives are not just passive perceptions, but also work with active cognitions. For example, during the conversation or driving cars, we receive information from the world, then process information with internal factors, and then return our decisions by actions or behaviors. And these processes involve many kinds of internal cognitive functions, including memory, decision, prediction, introspection, logic, ethics, math, language, and so on. Therefore, to understand how the brain works under normal life in a more comprehensive manner, we sought to extend our brain modeling efforts toward including representations regarding these active cognitions. I hope that this kind of topic is relevant to Qualia studies, because I think perception may not have a monopoly of Qualia, but there may be different Qualia for perception, imagination, or memory recall. And introspection should also have its own experience. And I wonder if there might be Qualia for functions or concepts like calculation or ethics. So to this end, we performed a kind of large-scale cognitive task experiments. So we asked human subjects to perform the total of 103 cognitive tasks that aims to sample many daily life cognitions, including perception, memory, beauty, introspection, logic, calculation, motor control, and so on. So this is one of the biggest samples of cognitive tasks for single subject fMRI modeling experiments. Then by analyzing the relationship between the task and the brain activity using several latent cognitive features that I will introduce shortly, we aim to reveal a cognitive representational space and the functional structures, and also see if the model can be generalizable to encode and decode brain activity even for novel task conditions. To do that, we made two kinds of encoding and decoding models. The model one, the first model, is what we call task type model. So in this model, so at each time point, the model simply represents the task feature by binary labels on which task the subject is performing at each time point, or so-called one-hot vector representation. And we built voxel-wise brain activity model by simple regularized linear regulations between task features and brain activity. And the model aims to reveal which brain parts represent what combinations of tasks, and thus to obtain kind of easily interpretable results. So once we build a model and calculate the principal components of the weight vectors, we can, for example, visualize relative relations of many cognitive tasks, or what we call the cognitive representational space of the human brain. Here, each point represents a cognitive task, and the position and the color represent their PC coefficients. Thus, similar position and color indicate similar representation in the human brain. The white oval show rough categories of each task. For example, you can see a cluster of movie recognition related tasks at the upper left, audio related clusters at the right, and language or logic at the middle downward. There are many ways to interpret this. Some are obvious, some are not so. For example, the movie recognition is close to image recognition, and that is kind of obvious because both of them are vision related things. But for example, there are some non-obvious things. For example, motor control, that is a kind of temporal sequence processing, is close to audio or introspection, but far from movie recognition. That is another temporal recognition. That is kind of non-obvious organization. Other example is that the language is close to logic, but far away from audio. That is another kind of non-obvious findings. And so we could visualize such comprehensive and novel structure of human cognition by analyzing this kind of diverse cognitive functions. And in the future, such high-level cognitive structures may be a useful guide to build multi-purpose human-like intelligent system like AI. Just like some people recently use visual category recognition brain data to improve or guide AI in vision tasks. Then by projecting the cognitive space onto the cortical space, we can also reveal the cognitive functional structure of the brain. Here, the color scheme is the same as the cognitive space of the previous slide, or shown here. And you can see how diverse cognitive functions form a kind of mosaic pattern across the cortex, as is presented here as color map. And to examine a bit more detail, so let's examine a specific region called IPL, or inferior parietal lobule. So we know that IPL is related to math or perception or numbers, but our map shows different colors in and around the IPL, like a red, black, green, suggesting the involvement of different combinations of cognitive functions. But to examine what these regions represent, we sampled 3 box cells, FGH, and show box cell-wise cognitive representations here, so FGH. So, and here, each plot represents the box cell-wise cognitive functions, and red mean those tasks are involved there, and blue mean not. And what we found out that all 3 regions or box cells represent logic or math that is consistent with our previous findings. However, the core contributing patterns vary within IPL. That is, the inferior IPL care about motor control and logic and math. The middle IPL care about image recognition and logic and math. The superior IPL care about movie recognition and logic and math. So that kind of the smooth transition between the this inferior to superior pattern is something that we really found using this kind of comprehensive analysis. This is a kind of a simple example of fine-scale cognitive analysis, and similar analysis can be done for entire brain. And actually, we published all the data and code in public that includes around 80,000 box cells or point in the brain times 103 tasks. So if you are interested in, please download from OpenNeuro or Open Science Foundation. Yeah, please enjoy them. And we can also visualize the task type model using a representational similarity matrix. Here, columns and rows represent each task, and the column map shows the similarity of weights pattern between tasks. The tasks were organized using a hierarchical cluster analysis so that similar tasks are closer together. So in this case, you can see several major clusters like visual, memory, or language. And if we look closely, you can find that similar tasks are again clustered, like let's say calculation-related things here, memory-related things here, recall of past or future is clustered around here. As a comparison, we can also calculate the representational similarity using the brain activity and perform the same procedure. So that is essentially a full brain RSA or representational similarity analysis, just as Dr. Moore and Dr. Scott and Kriegs invented. And you can see that the encoding model or the weight of task type model and RSA show largely similar results. So I know that there are several debates between encoding, decoding, RSA techniques, but I think that we do not have to choose one technique, but we can use as many techniques as possible to maximize the amount of information given data. And of course, building encoding and decoding models require more effort than the standard RSA procedure, but I think the effort will well pay off to get more information like voxel-wise examinations and generalization for novel conditions, as I will introduce from the next slide. So model 2 is what we call cognitive factor model. So model 1 is easy to handle and interpret, but the issue is that one-hot vector binary model is not generalizable to novel tasks. The cognitive factor model thus aims to transfer each task into a cognitive feature embedding space using neuroscience database. Specifically, we calculate simple correlation between 715 factor maps from neuroscience and brain activity of non-target subjects. This operation transfers each task to have 715 vector representation, allowing generalization to novel tasks. So then we examine both encoding and decoding model to see if the models are generalizable to novel tasks. For encoding model, we predict brain activity during novel tasks and found that the model shows significant prediction accuracy for more than 85% of the entire cortical areas. And that is one of the most predictive models of the human brain, I think, in the history of neuroscience. So in comparison, our previous passive audiovisual models predict up to around 40–50% of the movie evoked brain activity areas. So the cognitive models are much more comprehensive and provide accurate description of the brain. For decoding, we decode brain activity to test if a decoder can find the correct novel task out of two task candidates. And what we found was that the model achieves as high as around 95% decoding accuracy for decoding novel tasks. And one important note is the meaning of how to interpret generalization to novel tasks or task as samples. So people tend to misinterpret that we are doing just a pattern matching of evoked activity to pre-recorded activity. What we actually did was to predict or decode brain activity for the task that has never been tested for the subject. So this generalizability is achieved by using a cognitive factor embedding space and could potentially allow us for future applications like building a quantitative basis for brain-machine interfaces of cognition. So I talked about building encoding and decoding models of cognitive functions. From here, I will briefly talk about two related topics: representational structure of emotion and the relationship between cross-modality and attentional modulations as a subjective condition. So emotion is a subjective experience we almost always have in our daily life. To obtain a comprehensive representation of emotion, we asked human subjects to watch emotion-provoking audiovisual movies. We also label the movies regarding 80 emotions for each 1 second, thus having one of the most intensively labeled emotion movie sets of its kind. Then we built an encoding model using the labels as stimulus features and obtain the semantic structure of emotion in the brain. That's here. So in this case, just like semantic or cognitive spaces I talked earlier, each item is emotion, and color and position represents the relative similarity for each emotion. And you can see some cluster of interest here, interest here, nervousness here, beauty here, and so on. There are many ways to interpret, but one potentially interesting interpretation suggested is that this emotion structure might explain so-called misattribution of arousal or the suspension bridge effect, or tsulibashi koka in Japanese. I guess some of you know the suspension bridge effect. Suspension bridge is scary, and you can feel higher heartbeats or something. Then if there are two people on the bridge, like a man and a woman, then they tend to confuse the emotional and physiological responses to fear as those for romantic arousal. And there's a higher chance that they tend to be a partner. This kind of lovely psychological effect might, however, require that the emotional representations of fear and arousal should be similar. And when we look at the emotion structure, indeed, the fear cluster is close to sexual desire cluster. So I do not say it is a strong evidence, but this interpretation is at least not contradicting with the explanation that this representational similarity is related to the confusion in suspension bridge effect. However, another important point is that love is a bit far away from fear and sexual desire. So you can potentially get a partner by making use of the suspension bridge. But if what you need is love, then you need to separate examination to see if that generated love or not. Okay, the next topic is that the language processing have several interesting higher order cross-modal properties. One is modality invariance. That is, you can recognize words or linguistic contents when you read text or you hear voices. And early visual and auditory cortex only care either visual or auditory contents, but higher order associate cortex represents semantic contents in a modality invariant manner. Another higher order property is attention selectivity. For example, when you read a book in a busy cafe, you can selectively attend either reading or listening to avoid confusions. Again, visual or auditory early visual cortex or early auditory cortex tend not to be affected by attention, but somewhere in higher order areas should be modulated by such attention and reflect the perceived contents. The question is how these two higher order properties occur in the cortex. One extreme is that the areas for modality invariance and attention selectivity overlap, meaning that these two higher order processes happen jointly to reflect perceived contents. The other extreme is that these areas are distinct and they are processed completely separately, or there may be another chance that it might be somewhere in the middle and they partially overlap. Then we examined these possibilities by recording brain activity while participant either reading text, listening to story, or doing both while attending either visual or auditory inputs. Then we built voxel-wise encoding models to identify modality invariant and attentional selective regions. And what we found that the higher order properties, this motion invariance and attention selectivity were correlated in some regions. But there were also regions associated only with either modality invariance or either attention selectivity. And such effects are most robust in a semantic model rather than a phonemic feature model. So this indicates that the selective attention to a specific sensory modality regulates the semantic information that is partly shared across modalities. And using the finally, using that kind of modeling approach, we also aim to study how and why individuals differ, just as Tsuchiya-san discussed earlier. So our framework can model personal brains, so we can quantify individual differences of the functional brains. So to this end, we recruit special people like monozygotic or dizygotic twin people in order to dissociate genetic experience to genetic or experience-dependent components regarding brain activity. And we also recruit people with mental disease like schizophrenia or some kind of experts like top-level programmers to understand why they are so different. And you know that now personal genomics is changing the world. And I believe that in the near future, more people will talk about personal brainomics as a more dynamic way to think about our personality that might lead to more effective understanding, effective communication or education that may be tailored for each individual. So in sum, we aim to understand the brain by making explicit models between natural experiences and brain activity. And by using the modeling approach, we can get rich information to support our daily life, including comprehensive representations, its cortical functional structure, and the way to compare those different kind of features or attentional or cognitive conditions. And we can also use the model to decode perceptual or cognitive contents. Okay, so those work are supported by many people from many institutes and also funded by like JST and Kakenhi. So I would like to conclude my talk. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you for your great talk on encoding and decoding of cognitive functions. Please give a big hand to Dr. Nishimoto. Okay, so are there any questions? If you have questions, please raise your hand in Zoom or write questions in chat or in YouTube. All right, okay. Okay, now, do you want?
Yeah, maybe then I'll start. Yeah, thanks, Shinji. As usual, it's quite an impressive body of work. And I'm curious about the first part of your presentation where you showed the task, cognitive task map of the representation. And there I saw that, the auditory task and also language task is quite distinct, right? Especially in the tree. Right, yeah, this one. Yeah, so vision, memory, and language are kind of, in the family, but auditory stuff is, quite far from language. And I was wondering, that there is some kind of a study, I know, showing that individually, some people tend to be more visually oriented and some people are more auditory oriented, type. And whether this kind of thing is highly dependent on the individual or if this is some universal finding that you find in everybody.
So I think, so this kind of pattern repeats across all the participants we found. And then the reason for this kind of separation between auditory and language seems maybe that, so of course, language start from auditory inputs when we learn language. But as I also talked in the later, the third paper, so the language kind of getting more and more cross-modal or can be kind of distinct from not necessarily from auditory things. So currently I think that kind of separation that most of the at least adult people have in processing that kind of information. That is one reason that I can think of to why there are difference of distance between auditory and language tasks. But
you know, my question was probably more to do with then the nature of the auditory and the language task, possibly as well. Like if you try to use onomatopoeia kind of stimuli as an auditory stimuli or language stimuli, then that would be also very different, right? Like, you know, so it would probably depend on the set of the tasks that you chose as well.
That is possible to also, yeah. So our auditory task both contain some kind of linguistic and some kind of more like pure, you know, tone detection or how can I say, recognizing some beautifulness or sadness of sounds or something. So yeah, of course there are some task dependency that is possible.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so the next question, yes, Twitcher.
Yeah, sorry. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
A very interesting talk. I mean, it's sort of, my question is sort of related to what Tana was asking. You know, you showed the difference between phonemic and semantic models. I wonder whether it'll be interesting to look at people with dyslexia, developmental dyslexia, and reading difficulties, where one group has difficulties in phonological difficulties, others have problems more in sort of visual and semantic issues.
Yeah. Thank you for your comment. Yeah, that's really interesting topic. So yeah, I currently don't have the data for that specific participant group. So yeah, but yeah, it's really interesting next project that I can think of. So yeah, as I briefly talked about that, so we can do this kind of modeling approach for individual brain. So we can especially see this kind of cognitive space for dyslexia people to normal people, or we are also interested in how this may be different between like children to adults. So yeah, there are lots of interesting future plans that we can think of. So this is just a kind of first step to examine if this kind of framework can be applied to the human brain at all. So yeah.
Okay, so the next question is, okay, so this is the first question by Marieke. Do you want to ask it by yourself?
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah. So I was wondering if you also looked at the representation of the tasks in just a frontal parietal, basically multiple demand network. So these frontal parietal regions involved in higher order cognitive function, and whether that was whether tasks indeed, whether there was a structure there, and because in many studies it seems to be the case that these regions are activated across many different multiple demands when it's harder to do a task than for it's easy. So this is John Duncan's work, right? And it's quite interesting that, or in some ways that's frustrating. It's like, oh, they're always activated when there's a cognitive task, but what's actually being computed in these regions, if we don't really see a clear representational structure, it's a little bit harder to infer. So have you looked at that, and did you see a structure there, or were these regions showing very similar activity patterns for the different tasks?
Thank you for your suggestion. Yeah, actually that is kind of interesting topic. So what we found in around the frontal cortical areas are that actually we indeed can model and see fine scale structure of cognitive tasks just for frontal cortex also. And we also, what we've also found that so these frontal areas show more diversity across different participants compared with earlier areas. So, and that indicates that, for example, so most of the studies in frontal areas, people used to average across participants, and so that might kind of reduce the amount of signal that may be there as an individual subject, what might be just averaged out. And what we found is that we can do this kind of modeling approach for individual subjects, and we saw this kind of inter-individual differences. So to me that for those kind of cognitive things, so we can kind of expect that there should be difference between each individual persons compared to kind of hardwired in early visual or early auditory cortex. So I think, so I hope that more and more people are kind of interested in individual, person-wise assessment of those higher order cortex. Then we can get more signals or more information about how that kind of higher order cognitive processing can be explained by individually. That is what I thought.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Yeah, that makes sense. I think it's also, maybe this is more basic, but that's maybe somewhat related to what you're mentioning, but at a level of the sort of the HRF, so the hemodynamic response function, where we always use the V1 model, right? But in prefrontal regions, there are some papers also from Peter Benettini's lab some time ago, right, that showed that the hemodynamic response doesn't really have any not the standard function that we know from V1. And I've never really explored this in depth, but it seems like that may be important too, to maybe get a better, basically, if the HRF doesn't match very well, maybe we should try to have some sort of library of HRFs that we can use for prefrontal and parietal regions and already get a bit more activation there. Just wondering if you thought about that or have tried any of that, but that's sort of a more basic question, right, about modeling the signal.
Yeah. Thank you for your comments. Yeah, actually, yeah, that's some kind of advantages of our modeling framework. So we are not assuming any standard or canonical HRF, but we model the voxel-wise HRF pattern from the data.
Yeah,
so we can see the different HRF between different brain areas, and that may be one reason that why we can get this kind of predictive mapping for the entire cortex. So yeah, that's a very interesting, important part.
Yeah,
that's great. And both of the speakers already spontaneously kind of discuss. That's great. But also, from Shinji, your viewpoint, do you have any kind of question or suggestion to Marieke, especially in regard to towards the our goal of the understanding the Qualia structure kind of point of view, or either of you, if you have any kind of question, because this is supposed to be for the discussion on this kind of broader topic.
Yeah, I really enjoyed Dr. Ma's talk, and in particular, I feel like your approach is getting kind of more and more closer to what we call encoding modeling approach, meaning that so you care about like what kind of features are important in explaining brain activity. So that kind of share our kind of interest by building encoding model. So yeah, I'm glad that this kind of methods or analytical things are getting kind of toward a bit more shared goal. So that's what I thought.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that's great too. And I think there, as you said, it's not that one method is necessarily better than another. They're just approaches that are slightly different, but depending on the question you want to address, or you can try both and then compare. I think that is very good too. And it's true that with RSA, with the weighting, right, of different features, then we're getting a bit closer to encoding models. Of course, as you also mentioned, it's still less flexible because we're doing this at the level of the representation, the weighting, not at the level of the voxel. So encoding models are more flexible in that way. And that's interesting to think about these differences, right, between the different approaches. And I think, again, that it depends very much on the question you want to address, which approach you may choose. And there are certainly also a lot of similarities between the different techniques that can be used. Yeah, and it's very cool to see in your data or your analysis, right, that you also show both of them, and that ends up, at least for this data set, to be quite similar in terms of what comes out in the representation, at least. Yeah, so that's also good to see.
Yeah, that's right. Actually, we plotted the right side RSA because the Dr. Krieg Scott suggested as a reviewer. So yeah,
I see. Oh, that's funny.
He kind of showed his name when reviewing something. So yeah,
that's right. Yeah, that's true. He tends to do that. It's good. I think it's sort of making things more transparent. So I can imagine that he suggested that, but it's nice to see that it actually turns out to be very similar. Capturing the same information.
I think it's similar partly because this kind of large scale things examination give us kind of so the encoding model also is almost all the information of the brain activity, and it's kind of regularized because of the making it a predictive model. But other than that, so it's very close to the using the entire brain activity RSA. So that's why we see really close similarity here. So
yeah.
Right.
Okay. Yes. Great. Thank you for your interaction. Okay. So we have 2 more questions, and we like to take these 2 questions. So first is Ilya?
Ilya, yes.
Okay.
Hi. Yeah, thank you for a very fascinating talk, and I'm looking forward to digging into the Nature Communications paper. I have a question about sort of the classification of tasks that are similar in terms of input and output modality. So, I mean, you'd expect in a classification like this that input modality could explain a lot of the classification, what outputs they're expecting, either in terms of what modalities they use or what types of output they're giving, whether it's continuous or linguistic or so on. You could also imagine that explaining a lot of the classification. I'm wondering sort of within those narrower categories though. So if you ask people, maybe, for example, they're looking at object and rating its deliciousness subjectively or based on what they think other people would believe, or trying to recall a memory that's highly positive or highly negative, something like that, where the modalities are all similar. So I'm wondering if you looked at how much classification accuracy there is in the model for those cases. And second, maybe more interesting is whether that you might be able to find other emergent factors that would explain the differences in those tasks, right? So is the brain paying attention to subjective, objective, or to positive, negative, or something like that in terms of distinguishing those tasks within a modality set?
Thank you for your comment or question. Yeah, it's interesting. So currently, we are doing modeling this using three model. If we include the kind of regressors for early visual or auditory modality features, and so this plot is just one of our simplest form of representational examination using the task type model. So I think what you suggested is more like related to this kind of more like higher order cognitive features. So we kind of how can I say represent each task using the the combination of multiple cognitive features. And if we look closely to what the combinations of these, then maybe we can get a bit more information about, okay, we just call it some task as a task, but a task actually have lots of components, as you suggested. Some tasks may be a combination of 80% visual and 20% auditory, or some are maybe related to memory or positive or negative feelings. So yeah, that's kind of things to kind of dissociate further about each task is kind of interesting direction. And related to that, so what we did here is that this is kind of first level examination to see if this kind of cognitive tasks can be explained by encoding and decoding models. And then to do that, so we kind of use kind of simple task sets that is largely natural, but contain not so much combinations of cognitive features. But as you know that in our daily life, so like conversations, for example, have lots more cognitive factors kind of simultaneously activated, like like a motor control or emotion to logic or something. So what I'm really interested in is how this kind of a cognitive modeling approach can be applied or generalized to more naturalistic daily life conditions. So yeah, that's what we would like to do at the next stage. But before that, yeah, I agree that with you that it's interesting to see how each task may be factorized to the final scale cognitive features.
Thank you.
Is that, yeah.
Okay, so then Ken, do you want to ask your questions?
Hi, I really love your work. It's excellent, I think. And I just have this question. You briefly mentioned that these kind of approaches can be probably applied to artificial intelligence, which I think would be great. And this kind of categorical structure and internal geometrical structure and so on would be a valuable information to be applied to artificial intelligence. Having said that, when I talk with people who are involved in robotics, for example, when trying to work on emotion, all we have is a taxonomy of emotion, like all these major factors of emotion. And we do not have a dynamical model that would generate these emotional state. And the same can be said, I think, about perceptual categories, because we do have these categories and the taxonomy, but we do not know the dynamics, if you like, behind the processing, that would be processing these categories. So I was wondering, if this is just great and you can do a lot of, but I was just wondering if you really want to apply this kind of approach to artificial intelligence, how would you be making a link between these approaches and the dynamics behind it? I mean, which would be more implicit and more non-linguistic? And I was wondering if you have any insight on that. So,
thank you for your sort of provoking questions and comments. So, okay, so firstly, regarding AI things. So what I thought is that so currently most of the AI system have like single function, like visual recognition or playing Go or playing game. So so at some point they need to be a bit more multiple functioning system, like what we do now. So we are doing daily life, including visual cognition to commute or driving car or something. So at that stage, maybe they would need to kind of organize these functions in some way. For example, so some tasks may be solved by combination of this and this cognitive factors. And at that point, so maybe the cognitive cognitive space like this may be a kind of answer of how the human beings are solving or factorizing those kind of different functions. That is what I thought. And regarding dynamics, so that's the really interesting next stage. And currently, so what we visualize is a kind of static view of like a cognition or emotion. And currently, we don't know how those different emotions may be dynamically changed across one state to next state. So that is kind of a temporal second order or higher order dynamics is something that we miss in our current study. So that kind of things is a kind of next stage examination that we would like to have.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Great. Thank you.
Okay, so it looks like we've run out of time and we'd like to wrap up the meeting. Thank you again, Dr. Nishimoto, for your great talk and discussions.
Thank you.
In case you have more questions, we will open the gather after closing the symposium, and then you can ask questions to Dr. Nishimoto in private. Would it be okay, Dr. Nishimoto?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'll go to.
Okay, okay, thank you. So closing remarks will be given by Dr. Moriguchi-san?
Yes.
Okay.
Now time to close this symposium. I'm Yosuke Moriguchi from Kyoto University, a member of this course structure member. So I really thank for the two great speakers for insightful and helpful and interesting talk about RSA and brain activity. And I also thank for the audience to joining this symposium. I hope you enjoy this symposium. I really enjoy this. Thanks for all participants. And for the practical issue, we would like to get your feedback. Now I sent a link for the your feedback site. So we'd like to get your feedback in terms of how can we improve this event, who do you recommend as a speaker, and any comment about this symposium. So, for example, in this symposium, we use Gather to interact with speaker and audience. Perhaps some of you may not be familiar with this interacting in virtual space. So if you have any comments or better choice, so please give us your impression of comment. And if you have time and if speakers are fine, we can interact with speaker on Gather after this. So please join the Gather site. You can find maybe the link in the chat of the symposium. Future event, we will have some event in May, June, and July. For example, there's a consciousness talk hosted by Nao Tsuchiya, where researchers in consciousness, in the field of consciousness, talk about their research or their thought about consciousness. In the past event, you can find some past consciousness talk in YouTube, so you can find consciousness talk in YouTube site. So please see, in the past we will have May or June in the next opportunity. So please join the consciousness talk. And in July, we will have Symposium of Clear Structure in Europe 2021. In this conference, we will have again Dr. Marieke and as a member of Clear Structure. So we will have the symposium about Clear Structure. So please join this symposium.
just a quick announcement.
Yeah.
About the future planned consciousness talks. The second one is going to be next week on Thursday. One is by Mohammed on interpersonal EEG experiment. And then the other one is Aurelio Cortesi on decoding feedback. And then in June, we have Shinya Nishida and also Shigeki Nakauchi to talk about color Qualia again. And we have several more speakers planned in early July, Bruno van Swinderen and also Corinne Berham, talking about sleep and attention and so on. And we will update these information through APCN, Slack, and so on, which you'll probably talk about next, I guess. Yeah.
And now refer to the APCN. APCN is the Asian Pacific Consciousness Research Network, which is a research network that aims to facilitate interdisciplinary exchange of the idea among consciousness researchers and public. So if you want to continue discuss the issue raised in this symposium or the issue about consciousness, please join the Slack or please go to the, we have a website or APCN, so please Google APCN and go to this research site. So this is the end of the symposium, and we'd like to thank for the Korea Structure staff member and the speaker and audience for this symposium. So see you next opportunity. Thanks for the all participants. Thank you. And please go to the other site if you continue to discuss about the issue in this symposium. Thank you.
Thank you.